everybody, it's Saturday, May 3rd, 2014. Get ready for the weekend video. Here it comes. Okay, so predictably, I am going to comment on this past Thursday's Powercast, which was entitled, We Have a Great High Priest. And what I want to do is just read you some highlights of what Mike said in that 1-hour Powercast, which was taken from a 6-session seminar that Mike did a few years ago in Florida called The Great High Priest. So I'm just going to read you some things that Mike was talking about. He was teaching from Hebrews chapter 7, and here are some statements that he made. He said, the law wasn't perfect, the priesthood wasn't perfect, and the sacrifice wasn't perfect. And he's referring to the ceremonies of the Jews leading up to the coming of Christ. They were under the law. They had a high priest, but he wasn't a perfect high priest, and they used sacrifices, which were bulls and goats, and that was the blood sacrifice. And of course, it wasn't perfect; it had to be repeated every year. So, in explaining all of this, the focus was on the high priest at this point, and Mike says that the fault was found with the people, meaning all the people, because there was still fault found with the priesthood. See, God was not looking at the people. The priest offered the sacrifice for all the people. It wasn't. That's how sin was covered for a year, and but fault was still found with the people because fault was found with the priesthood. The priest wasn't perfect. Now, this priesthood that we're talking about, it says in Hebrews that Jesus is the great high priest who was called after the order of Melchizedek, which is this mysterious figure from the Old Testament that Abraham went to. Okay. Now, the reason Mike says that the Old Covenant priesthood was not perfect was because, number one, the priests all died. And number two, the high priest not only offered up sacrifice for all the people, but for his own sins as well. So, if your high priest has sin, he's not perfect. So, and since God is looking at the priest and his sacrifice, not on the people, there's a problem. So, in Hebrews chapter 7, it says that Jesus is our high priest. But he is a perfect high priest. See, Jesus himself was perfect. He does not die. He never dies. And not only that, he had a perfect sacrifice, which was himself and his blood, not the blood of a bull or a goat. And Mike reminds everybody again, the focus of perfection is not on the performance of your life. It is on the performance of the high priest. It's on the performance of your high priest. And again, in Hebrews chapter 7, it says that Jesus is your high priest. So, God is not looking at whether the people have done a good enough job. God is looking at whether the high priest has done a good enough job. See, when the high priesthood was so imperfect in the Old Covenant that the priests were only ceremonially cleansed. They had to follow the ceremony of cleansing perfectly because they themselves could not be cleansed of sin. They could not cleanse him of sin so that he could go into the Holy of Holies and offer the sacrifice. And of course, the sacrifice also went through a ceremonial process to find it without fault or blemish. And then the rubber met the road when the priest went into the Holy of Holies to offer the sacrifice because God didn't always accept it. And because of that, the priest had to wear bells on his robe. So the whole time he was in the Holy of Holies, you could hear the bells ringing. And he also went in there with a rope tied around his waist because if the ringing of the bells stopped, something went wrong. God did not accept the sacrifice, and they would pull on the rope to pull him out of the Holy of Holies because the priest died. If God did not accept the sacrifice, the priest himself died. And they had to come up with a new high priest and try it again. So, Mike makes a very profound statement then. He says, any person, denomination, or religion that preaches Christ and then place the guilt and the performance of perfection back on your life is Antichrist teaching. He says it's taking away the glory from Christ, and it's taking the glory away from the great high priest. It's also taking the glory away from the perfect sacrifice. Mike says it's doctrines of demons, and I couldn't agree more. So let me get to the conclusion of what I find important about this, and I'll get to that. You see, there's one thing that Mike was hammering in this first session of the Great High Priest series that I pretty much summarized. Mike says, when you understand that your perfection is based on your high priest and his performance, and not you and your performance, your conscience will be purged of any guilt and shame that you have before God. It's a wonderful thing to come to understand. It's good news. And let me get to the rest of it. See, when you recognize that Jesus was the great high priest, and that he was the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice, and it was not the performance of the people that God looked at, but their high priest and their sacrifice, and that sacrifice was for the sin of the world, you can permanently be released from ever judging yourself or anybody else in the entire world again, because that perfect sacrifice and that perfect high priest was for the sin of the world. There is no more performance that is ever upon us, not even one, not even belief. The belief of the Old Covenant was for the Old Covenant. It was for Abraham, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. However, the Bible says that Jesus became the sin of the world who knew no sin, so that we could be the righteousness of God, not just to be credited. In Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about the belief of the old ones, of the old covenant. And it talks about how their faith got them a good report, but it didn't get them the promise. They, without the rest of us, would not receive the promise, and that was the promise of perfection. And that promise came through the great high priest, through the perfect high priest, through the perfect sacrifice that only needed to be given once and not every year, because he never dies, and it was for the world. No more performance, not even one, not even belief. All right, everybody, you have a good week.